welcome to Lancaster. I'm your host, Danny Martin. Thanks for tuning in. Well, today I'm going to do a whole episode dedicated to the propaganda of our local newspaper, the LNP. Yeah, normally I would have an interviewee here because I think it's generally more interesting. But today you get to hear me rant about the newspaper. I'm flying solo. I started writing a paper going over their various propaganda techniques, but then I figured, well, why don't I just talk about it? So here it goes. And to be fair, let me back this up. I do appreciate certain things about the LNP. For many years, they've published many of my letters to the editor. Granted, they do change a few words here and there, but we'll get to that. I would say their local reporting is, decent on keeping people informed on what's going on. But when it comes to political coverage, they are so not balanced and fair. And maybe they don't care if they're not. I mean, that's why people call them LDNP, which is pretty much my prime motivation for starting a podcast to begin with. See, on the national level, anyone who's paying attention pretty much knows mainstream media, corporate legacy media, whatever you want to call it, is corrupt and compromised, to be blunt. But we have good alternatives through independent media you can find online and through podcasters like Joe Rogan, Tim Pool, Adam Carolla, I'm just naming a few off the top of my head, Jimmy Dore, Jordan Peterson, and my personal favorite, Dave Smith. And none of those guys are overtly partisan. I mean, they might have political leanings, but some of them I just mentioned are classical liberals, and some of them are more conservative. But none of them are establishment. So what I want to do on a local scale is provide the same thing, a vehicle for alternative viewpoints to the establishment, which LNP represents to a T. And just because they publish letters and op-eds from opposite ends of the political spectrum doesn't mean they're even-handed. They control the language, and language is everything. Ever notice how frequently their opinion pieces and letters frequently make use of pejorative terms such as conspiracy theorist or far-right, extremist, white supremacist, white nationalist, Christian nationalist, and people will just repeat it without even knowing how the terms apply or how do you define that. There is a recent Christine Flowers piece. She articulated well that, the term fascist gets bandied around too often and then kind of to the point where its meaning is devalued. Everyone's a fascist. And just because that particular Christine Flowers piece was featured in LNP doesn't mean they're balanced. It doesn't make it okay. Here's a writer saying that pejorative terms are used too often. Now for our next piece, here's some pejorative terms. Let me give you a concrete example. In this past Sunday's newspaper, there was a front page article. Trans student rights, attempts to ban books drive school board race in Manheim Township. Now after reading this article, I still have no idea what the Democratic slate stands for other than opposing the Republican boogeyman, I guess. See, I counted, so here's one of the first propaganda techniques. They use the term far right 5 different times in this article. This is coming directly from the Democratic candidates to describe what they perceive of the Republican candidates. And not one time was far right put into quotes. It was just spoken like, oh, this is what they're trying to fight against. It's far right. But far right was the narrative constructed from the Democratic candidate. So shouldn't that be in quotes? I'm going to read for a second what I posted about this on social media. By omitting the quotes and repeating the pejorative, LNP is able to obscure the source of the label, normalize its use, and reinforce the idea that it is just an accepted fact that the Republicans are quote-unquote far right. What happened to in my view, which is used so prominently to water down letters. Apparently, the Democratic candidates not only get a pass on the watering down, their pejorative term use doesn't even merit quotations. Now, speaking of quotations, I want to go off on a tangent on a separate article that came out just a few weeks ago. It was also a front page article, and it's titled, "A Positive Force, Grandmas for Love in Warwick Form as Counter to Moms for Liberty Values, Ideals." Now, in this case, there was quotations in the headline. Okay, first of all, who was it that said a positive force? Because it was clearly quoted. Well, it turns out, if you read the article, that one of the Grandmas for Love wants their organization to be a positive force. Well, that's great. I don't know. It just seemed kind of gratuitous that you lead the title that way. But in this case, I mean, you don't know. Maybe it's somebody else who's calling them a positive force, but it's them calling themselves a positive force, or what they hope to be, which is fine. But don't all organizations want to be a positive force? I don't know. I just can't see them headlining an article about Moms for Liberty the same way, because I'm sure Moms for Liberty want to be a positive force too. Now, the article goes on and cites the Southern Poverty Law Center, labeling Moms for Liberty a hate group. Now, this brings us back into the first article I was talking about, the more recent one about the school board. And I want to bring up the second major technique of propaganda here. The first one was the repeated use of those derogatory terms, far right in this case. The second major technique is the invocation of authority, in this case the SPLC, to imply that the Republican candidates are associated with quote-unquote hate or anti-government groups. Both the Independence Law Center and Moms for Liberty in this article. Now, at this point, unless the reader takes the time to research the credibility of the SPLC and what exactly those groups did that merited the labels from it, the implication is that it must be true because of the authority invoked. But so consequently, by way of either wanting to work with said organization or social media posts that show, according to the article, support for the organization's policy positions, well, then the candidates automatically inherit its alleged sins. You know, this is just meant to divide people and turn them against the candidates, basically. So I want to address the SPLC for a second. There's a great video online, The Truth About the SPLC, posted on YouTube. Look for it. It's a 3-minute video. And, you know, I don't just take their word for it. I looked into the actual articles that were being cited in this video, and they're there. And, you know, some of these are reputable, you know, quote unquote reputable mainstream media sources, you know, kind of left sources that were actually showing what a horrible reputation the Southern Poverty Law Center has. There's a headline here from Current Affairs. The Southern Poverty Law Center is everything that is wrong with liberalism. And there's a quote in here, useful for illustrating some of the worst and most hypocritical tendencies in American liberalism. There's another headline here from an article from The Week called The Sad Hysteria of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in it, there's a couple of quotes. It is too busy enforcing liberal orthodoxy against its intellectual opponents. And here's a political article that says, more of a partisan progressive hit operation than a civil rights watchdog. Even Politico, now, I'm not recommending anyone go out there and read Politico. I mean, it's a horrible publication. Like, Matt Taibbi just put out a piece last week about a political article, which he says might be the worst op-ed in history. Politico is basically justifying the Canadian Parliament when they were cheering on this ex-Nazi guy, and they were saying, "Oh, it's not so bad." Like, but anyway, the point is, if SPLC is so bad that even Politico is calling them out, that gives you an idea. My point here is, you know, this is the organization that LNP is invoking as well. You know, they call them a hate group, so it must be true. And no, I mean, this is not a reputable organization. They got an F from Charity Watch, and they've had multi-million-dollar settlements for calling at least one person an extremist and smearing his name when it wasn't the case. Now, both of these articles, these LNP articles, the one about the school board race and the one about Grandmas for Love, they were written by the same reporter, and I don't want to mention her by name or intuit her motives. Maybe it's an honest mistake, and she's, she doesn't know how bad SPLC really is, and maybe she's just taking the word of the Democratic candidates who are painting the other side as far right. Let's say it's an honest mistake. Now, I see other instances of other LNP reporters actually doing activism online. It's very subtle. Let me give you an example. The whole thing about banning books, it's actually not accurate. I have talked to all of the Republican candidates for school board in Manheim Township, and none of them want to ban books. They just want to create transparency by having a mechanism in place where books can be flagged for sexually explicit material, and parents can choose to opt out accordingly to whether their kids should read it or not. That's basically it in a nutshell. And on the state level, there's actually a bill introduced by Representative Russ Diamond, and on State Rep Tom Jones's website, you can find a statement about House Bill 1659 and its counterpart, Senate Bill 7, introduced by Senator Ryan Aument. This bill would create an opt-in policy that would notify parents of the sexually explicit content by including a list of the book titles on the form, give parents the opportunity to review the materials, require parents to give direct consent for their children to be provided or have access to explicit content, provide the child with non-explicit alternatives if their parents do not opt in. Neither bill would ban any books from any Pennsylvania schools or libraries. This is all there on Tom Jones's website. Now, let's see what Brett Schultes, who works for LNP as an investigative reporter, has to say about it. I found a tweet of his from October 4th. Actually, there's two tweets here. The first one says, PA State Rep Tom Jones of Lancaster County today is holding a meeting to promote a bill to block student access to books. Those shown on his website are critically acclaimed YA works centering Black, Latino, and or queer experiences, which have been targeted by Moms for Liberty. Again, the Moms for Liberty invoking that dreaded hate group. He continues with another tweet. As with efforts to ban these books on the school district level, proponents strive to equate the books, often well-reviewed and lauded YA novels that are widely available at bookstores, with quote-unquote obscene material. So do you see what he's doing here? He says, as with efforts to ban these books. Like, no, it's not the same thing. But you want it to be associated with that. You want it to be conflated with banning books. And in both tweets, he says either these are critically acclaimed works or they're lauded novels. So, tell us how you really feel. You obviously disagree with attempts to block student access to them because they're great books. That sounds like activism to me. That's not objective at all. Now, the other issue being debated in the school board race is regarding trans students. And this brings me to a letter I wrote kind of to combat misinformation, and is kind of the whole reason that I got into the idea of podcasting, because they were changing my words. Here's the background. I wrote this letter in response to a July 27th op-ed titled, Local Clergy, Faith Community Members Promote Facts Surrounding LGBTQ plus Health Care. Now, there's stuff I agree with in this. This is written by a group of local pastors, and there's some stuff about anti-bullying that I agree with. Of course, no one should be bullied, but there was a particular passage I took issue with because it's not only false, but it's actually harmful misinformation. There's a section about puberty blockers, and it says, these push the hormonal pause button. They don't create permanent changes. Now, I took issue with this because it's simply not true. And to LNP's credit, they didn't change this part of the letter. Here's what I wrote in regards to that claim. This may be misleading and could give people a false sense of comfort about these treatments. The Scientific American article that was linked to in the column only addresses a small subset of the possible side effects of puberty blockers. A simple internet search on, say, Lupron yields a more comprehensive list of both short and long-term effects. Now, if what I had written was not true, they wouldn't have printed the letter because LNP prides itself supposedly on not printing any misinformation. So either the pastors were right or I was right. So why was the original op-ed titled "Local Clergy, Faith Community Members Promote Facts Surrounding LGBTQ plus Healthcare"? Sounds like one particular fact was kind of not a fact. But let me move on. Okay, so this is what really bothered me was they started changing the words in my letter. In the next paragraph I wrote, "Also not mentioned in the clergy's op-ed is the fact that the vast majority of gender dysphoric kids who take puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones like testosterone. These do create permanent changes!" Exclamation point. So in the published version, they removed the exclamation point, and instead of the vast majority of kids, they said many kids. Now, hold on a second. This is a huge difference. Which version is more accurate? Their many kids or my vast majority of kids? Now, this isn't in the letter because I had a word limit, but according to the BBC, a Tavistock study found that 43 out of 44 participants who took puberty blockers went on to take cross-sex hormones. That's 98%, hence the vast majority. So I was never told by LNP why they made this change, but I can only assume the editorial board saw some cherry-picked Big Pharma-sponsored study that maybe supported their own version. I don't know. So that was the first set of changes. Now, in the very next sentence, I talk about, here's what I say, people might want to research how testosterone can affect girls. Now, this got changed in the published version too. People might want to research how testosterone can affect those who were assigned female at birth. Okay, so I'm not allowed to call them girls. And I actually emailed LNP and asked them, why can't I call them girls? And I was kind of given a boilerplate response about quote-unquote Associated Press style and guidance. And, these are the terms to be used when speaking of quote-unquote transgender persons. Now, I want to come back to this, but let me go off on a tangent here. I want to say something about LNP. They never print anything brave. And what I mean is LNP only relies on what you'd call official establishment sources and deems everything else misinformation. So that's why you only see Associated Press sources. They've admitted they only carry AP sources for their national and international news. So you'll never see, for example, a Ron Paul op-ed like we sometimes see in the Lancaster Patriot, explaining why we shouldn't be sending money and arms to Ukraine. No, that's not an acceptable establishment position. It'd be hard to imagine had it existed in its current form back in 2003. Imagine LNP exposing the myth of WMDs in Iraq. So, and just as unlikely now, you would never find an opinion piece from them positing that, hey, maybe it was the Biden administration that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline a year ago. Mind you, that was the largest emission of methane in history and a pretty egregious act of eco-terrorism, which would be ironic for an administration that supposedly wants to safeguard the environment with stringent energy policies. But I'm going off on a tangent. Yeah, it's kind of obvious. Biden pretty much said we were going to do that. So it wouldn't be out of line to speculate that we did that, and it's pretty bad. But you wouldn't find that in an op-ed in the LNP is my point, because that would be considered conspiracy theory. Just like the WMD's cover-up would have been back then, until it became safe to discuss years after the fact. That's kind of my point. Let me segue a little bit about the coverage of the COVID pandemic. This was the exact similar path. Only push the official narratives, and everything else is basically conspiracy theory. Like, the idea that the virus originated in a lab. Of course, now it's okay to talk about that. So this is probably why all my letters during this time were ignored. Like, I think I wrote a letter challenging Penn Medicine's vaccine mandate, saying, what about all the doctors and nurses who have natural immunity? Why do they need to get jabbed? And aren't those the kind of people that you want on your front line? What happened to them being heroes? And what about the risks? And have you looked at the VAERS database? And if you want to curb so-called vaccine hesitancy, why not conduct an investigation of vaccine injuries in the county? Nope, can't ask it. There's a piece called Why Young Children Should Get Immunized Against COVID-19. It's dated November 14th, 2021. You can look it up online. Now, the original print version, and you can use the Wayback Machine to verify this. The original print version stated that nearly 1 million children have been hospitalized with COVID. Now, if you look up the same article now, it says many children have been hospitalized with COVID. According to the Wayback Machine, it was changed on November 26, 12 days after it was originally published, saying nearly 1 million children. Now, I knew at the time that this was a bogus number, and I'm pretty sure I called them out on it. I don't know if that had anything to do with the change, but I think my letter said something to the effect of, look, you can take the disease seriously, but you don't have to fearmonger. Well, they didn't like that. Of course, they're not going to print that, even though it's true. But the same doctor since then, in a more recent article from March 12, 2023, reflecting on our pandemic journey from March 2020 to now, the same doctor has claimed in this article that long COVID affects 1 in 3 people with the disease. So, I don't know, that sounds far-fetched also, and they haven't changed that one yet, but I don't know about the credibility of this doctor. But circling back to the letter I wrote about kids with gender dysphoria, and by the way, I highly recommend, you can read a book on this topic called Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. It's very informative. But anyway, so the irony here is LNP is allowed to fearmonger with this number. Nearly 1 million children have been hospitalized. But yet I can't point out that the vast majority of kids who take puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormone, something as serious as that. But they downplay it. And my words are backed up with an actual study. Back to the changing of the word girls to those assigned female at birth. So here again was LNP hiding behind the Associated Press as their shield. Well, this is what Associated Press says we should call them. I mean, the problem is the Associated Press always right? If the Associated Press is carrying a lot of bad water, then aren't you just serving as a valve down that pipeline? Now, here's the thing. You might innocently ask, well, it's just a word. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that language actually matters. It's like Jesse Kelly always says, language leads to mindset, and mindset leads to action. In this case, the action is leading kids down a path of potentially harmful medication. And that's why I question the whole idea of unconditional affirmation. And so, in conclusion about this letter, I'm totally on board with the anti-bullying theme of it, but my point is that unconditional affirmation could well be even worse for these kids. Okay, now let's start to wrap this up. Why is LNP like this? Why are they so guarded of this narrative? Now, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think I don't know the editors, but I think they're decent people with good intentions. Maybe they just have, some blind spots. And oh, by the way, that was another thing they changed in the second to last paragraph. I say, it's one thing to be supportive and empathetic, but respectfully, isn't it possible to overcompensate if it causes us to have blind spots? So they changed that blind spots bit to if it causes us to overlook important information. I guess blind spots was too harsh, but I think it's accurate to describe LNP. Fast forward to today, October 18th, there's another front page article about the school board race, and it's titled, "In Competitive Lancaster County Races, Republicans Steer Away from Discussing Library Restrictions, Transgender Policies." Now, right off the bat, the title itself has negative connotations. Why talk about what they're steering away from instead of what they actually stand for? So it's a negative instead of a positive. And the article, once again, goes right into mentioning those evil Moms for Liberty again, as if they should be the centerpiece of the race. At least it didn't invoke the almighty SPLC this time. But what they did do is they brought in someone else to denounce them. The very second paragraph says, "But Manheim Township Commissioner John Baer said Moms for Liberty's stances are not shared by many of the local Republican elected officials he works with. We don't want extremism," said Baer, who also heads the Township Republican Committee. "I'm in the middle, and I think most people are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum in Manheim Township." So you see what they're doing here? With this testimony about, what most people want, they're trying to create a false bandwagon effect by the constant repetition of these pejoratives like extremism. And what it's effectively going to do is move the goalposts of the Overton window of acceptable dialogue so that people won't dare say that Moms for Liberty is not extreme or that anyone who shares any of their views is anything but an extremist. So I'm going to summarize all the techniques we've talked about here. There's repetition. There's invoking authority. Here we had John Baer kind of denouncing for them, and before it was the SPLC. And one of the articles we talked about was the one that the clergy members wrote, and of course they're invoking all these medical institutions, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, etc., so that no one dares question with their ideas of age-appropriate, gender-affirming care, as they call it. And they did the same thing during COVID, invoking Fauci or whoever, the CDC. And no, those organizations can never be corrupt. They're not at all a revolving door for big pharma executives and regulatory capture. But moving on, what are some of the other techniques we talked about? Yeah, the use of pejorative terms. We talked about those. Creating a bandwagon fallacy, moving goalposts of the Overton window, creating associations. Yeah, you don't want to be associated with Moms for Liberty. Manipulation of language, subjective headlines, selective use of quotes, and just outright lying. But I want to end on a positive note. L&P is not all bad, and I actually really appreciate that they've published a lot of my letters over the years, some of which they didn't actually change the content. And one example is the letter that was published back in May called "The Other Half of the Story," which I wrote about that harmful Russiagate narrative that pretty much divided our country, and it was total nonsense, and people with TDS were falling for it. But I knew it was nonsense even before people in authority started to say, okay, yeah, we can validate that this was total BS. But anyway, so the fact that they published that leads me to believe they have actually a healthy skepticism of the intelligence agencies that drive our foreign policy. And towards the end of the letter, I say something kind of conspiratorial. I'm surprised they left it in. I encourage people to, quote unquote, overcome the notion that too many people, institutions I trust would have to be in on it for it to be a lie. So they let me write that. And that's great. So in conclusion, L&P editors are on board with this principle when it comes to the military-industrial complex, I guess. But they don't seem to have made that connection that it could also apply to maybe the medical-industrial complex and big pharma and maybe the teachers' unions, whoever's driving the trans agenda, both that and some of the lies we saw during COVID. Well, that's my show for today, and thanks for listening, and to be continued.